Beside me here, I have my PlayStation 5, and this thing is a fantastic piece of cutting-edge gaming hardware. Given the recent hardware shortages, I feel very lucky to have this thing, but it does lack in one key area. It's not very good at retro gaming. And me, I'm an 80s baby. My formative years were spent playing NES, SNES, Sega Genesis, N64, and, well, you get it, I could go on. I have a lot of good memories tied up with those games, and I would love to be able to play them again. But I also don't want to have 10 different retro game consoles cluttering up my living room. I'm trying to at least pretend like I'm a functional adult here. So that's where this comes in. This is a Raspberry Pi 4, and we are going to transform this into a retro game console. In fact, we're going to transform this into every game console up until about the Sega Dreamcast. Yeah, how's that for a throwback? Did any of you guys have Sega Dreamcasts? Because I did, and I absolutely love that thing. We might even be able to get this to play Wii games, although that might be pushing it, almost as much as the sponsor segue is pushing it. Have you heard of Skillshare? Skillshare is an online learning community where you can learn directly from creative professionals working in the field. I'm currently taking Jordy Vandeput's course on color correcting and color grading in Premiere Pro. Getting your colors right between shots is surprisingly hard to do, especially when you're changing locations. I've learned so much taking this course, and I really feel like it's made me a better filmmaker and a better editor. Hopefully, the colors of this video speak for themselves and are a good demonstration of all the stuff I've learned in this course. Skillshare members have unlimited access to a wide range of classes on all sorts of different subjects, from illustration straight through to logo design, and it's all completely ad-free. It's a great service. I've been enjoying it a lot, and I think you will too. Right now, Skillshare has a special offer for my viewers. The first 1,000 people to register with the link in the video description will receive a 1-month free trial membership of Skillshare so that you can start exploring your creativity today. Now that we're here in the shop, we can get started on the first step of this build, which is going to be building a case for this tiny little adorable computer. And because it's so small, we're not gonna need a lot of materials. We have some walnut here, a little bit of oak here, and then the magnets that let me down in my last video. Hopefully they'll do a little bit better this time. Why don't you guys come around to this side and I will show you what I have worked out design-wise on the laptop. Because we're gonna be working with incredibly small pieces, I figured that this was a great opportunity to use my X-Carve. So over here on the computer, I have easel loaded up, which is the CNC control software for the X-Carve, and on it, I've got a bunch of pieces designed. So I'm going to build this case out of 4 main pieces. These 3 that you can see on the screen here are going to be made out of walnut, and then we have this other one over here, which is made out of the oak. Now, instead of explaining all the different details and why I designed each one the way that I did, I think it would be easier if I just carved them first and then explained how they work. One of the main things that I wanted to explore in this build was using my CNC to build things in layers. It would have been impossible to cut the shape that I wanted all at once, but by making it in 4 individual pieces and then joining those pieces together, I was. Out of this single piece of walnut, I cut the front grille, the bottom of the case, and then the top of the case. And then, out of this tiny little slab of oak, I cut a middle section. If you look closely, you can actually see that I used the CNC to cut out a bunch of little pockets for my magnets, but we'll talk more about those later. All right, that's number 2. Let's see how these guys look outside of the machine. Carving is now done, and all we have to do now is break all of these individual pieces out of the, bigger piece. Somebody told me that a really good way to do this is just with a hammer and chisel, so we're gonna try that. Yeah, that actually worked pretty well. Now that we have our 4 pieces separated, let me show you approximately how they're gonna go together. So this one is the bottom one. Raspberry Pi is going to fit in here like so. And this one is the middle piece, which is going to go on there, although I have to carve a little bit out of the back of it. Then this one goes on top like so. And then finally, this one goes in the front. So a couple little fitment issues that I noticed right off the bat. Obviously this guy is just way too thick and it looks kind of dumb as is. So I'll plane this down on the drum sander. And then the other thing I noticed is that this stack of 3 ends up being a little bit higher than that. So I will probably fix that by just reducing the thickness of this guy a little bit. I didn't want to risk sending such a small, delicate piece through the planer or the jointer. But the drum sander, with its abrasive head, did a great job of reducing the thickness of that front grille, as well as the middle oak piece without doing any damage.
it just took quite a few passes. The drum sander isn't great at removing a lot of material all at once.
Now that we got those small issues taken care of, we are going to glue this midsection to the bottom section. And then we're gonna glue the front section on after that. And then as for the top, well, I have a little bit of a surprise left for there. Oh no, wait, I already talked about the magnets. Yeah, I'm gonna use magnets.
I used to think that my larger glue-ups were tricky, but gluing together pieces this small presented its own unique challenges. Eventually though, I got everything balanced, clamped, and left it all to dry overnight.
It is now 24 hours later, hence the wardrobe change, and the glue is now definitely dry. So before we attach this front grille to the main chassis, I love coming up with little names for the pieces as I go, we had to do a couple little things to this first while we still have good, easy access to it. The first one is going to be widening this I/O port here. You can see that there's not quite enough room for all these USB ports and this Ethernet port here. I obviously remembered to include it in the walnut piece, but I forgot to include it in this oak piece, so we're gonna chisel that out and saw it out by hand.
This is the part of the video where I expose myself as a true novice woodworker. Using a small hacksaw, which by the way is the only saw that I could fit into this tight opening, I cut 2 lines up to the height that I needed. I then used a semi-sharp chisel to chip away at the oak until my Raspberry Pi's USB ports had room to fit. Next, it was time to do a little bit of trolling. You see, last time I drilled through a PCB like this in my desk build video, quite a few people got mad at me in the comments. But here's the thing, there's not really any traces that run anywhere near these holes, and it's a great foolproof way to locate your mounting standoffs. So I gotta keep doing it. Once the holes were drilled, I threaded in some brass standoffs that I could then mount the Raspberry Pi to. And then, well, then I mounted the Raspberry Pi, only to discover a small issue with my design.
So between this front grille and the actual board itself, there's a little area here which I was intending to use to put a fan. Specifically, this little one right here. But then I got it, and I was like, that's a little bit smaller than I imagined it would be. So I ended up ordering a different fan, this one right here, but this one is significantly thicker than the first one. So we don't have enough clearance to get this one in there properly. But that's the nice thing about having your own CNC. I turned off the camera for like 5 or 10 minutes, booted up easel, and now I have a redesigned front grille that's ready to be carved.
Being able to remake components like this on the fly is so handy. Can you imagine how heartbreaking it would have been to discover that mistake had I hand carved the front grille? Yeah, I might have just scrapped the whole build at that point. Lucky for me though, I was able to carve a new piece with a new and improved design. This time I included a recessed area for the fan that held it tightly in place. No need for glue or even any mounting screws.
Let's see how this guy looks now. Lots of dust, but yeah, I think that should do the trick. Oh, sorry, just give me one quick second here. I'm gonna upload a photo to my Instagram account, which if you aren't following me, by the way, you might want to because I do upload photos live of my projects as I'm doing them. So if you're ever curious about what I'm building next, you might wanna check it out. Put that in there, and then beauty. Okay, now we have the kind of clearance that we need. Although this is still looking a little bit too chonky for my taste, so we're gonna do the same thing we did before and plane it down on the drum sander. Okay, this fits in there very nicely now. Everything looks pretty good, so I think it's time that we glued the front grille in place.
Paradoxically, when you're working on small pieces like this, wood movement can be even more of an issue than it normally is. I had to force this wedge into the front of the case in order to return it back to its original shape. After that though, it was an extremely straightforward glue up.
It's about an hour later. See how we did. Nice. A couple little rough edges, but I've already set up a little area over here where we can clean those up. Let me show you. On my left here, you'll see that I've taped a piece of sandpaper to the desk. So what we're gonna do is we're gonna take our box and we're gonna rub it across it and sand it down so that all the sides of it are perfectly flat. Because you'll see there's a couple spots like here where there's a little ridge and a little bit there too. And I want this thing to be nice and flat when we're done. So this is a good way to do it. Basically, we're just referencing the surface of the table in order to flatten this out.
At this point, you might be asking yourself, why use a table and not a random orbital sander? And the answer is you just get way more control when doing it by hand. It's really easy to accidentally hold a vibrating tool at a slightly off angle and end up removing more material than you ever intended to. I found that this method was perfect for dialing in all those little millimeter adjustments.
Okay, so that's pretty close to where I want it. Now, before we go any further, I want to install all the magnets that I'm going to use to secure this top to the main body here.
Since all the magnet holes were machine carved, installing them was as easy as adding a single drop of CA glue and then gently tapping them into their individual holes. Once the glue set, they were in there permanently.
So let's see how these two halves fit together. Pretty good, actually. That's not bad at all. Okay, we got to do a little bit more sanding to smooth out these edges, but then we'll be on to the finishing.
This pass of sanding was more about shaping the case than it was about making sure everything lined up. I rounded off some of the corners by hand, and then I used a random orbital sander to do what my friend calls pillowing, where you slightly round and bevel your piece of wood. I felt like this little detail was kind of reminiscent of some of those rounded edges that were so popular in 90s gaming consoles like the SNES and the Genesis.
Look at that. That is looking pretty damn good. Now we're ready to do some finishing. And if you watch my last video where I was making that Bluetooth speaker, you know that finishing in these little slots is an absolute pain. So we're gonna try something new today. We are going to try spraying on the finish. This is my makeshift spray booth. As you can see in the rest of the shop, there's a lot of stuff going on right now, so I wanna be as mindful of overspray as I possibly can be.
After I got my makeshift spray booth set up, it was time to test it out. I loaded up some water-based varnish and gave it a spray. While this did end up working decently well, in retrospect, this sprayer was probably a bit oversized for the job. In the future, I think I'll have to invest in a little airbrush for smaller pieces like this.
So now that the finish is dry, basically at this point in the normal video, we would almost be done. We still have quite a bit of work in front of us. So let's go home and install the hardware and then also install all the software that's gonna drive this thing, because that's gonna take some time. It's now the next day and we are back home and ready to dive into some hardware. Remember earlier in the video, I said something like we might be able to get it to run some GameCube and Wii games? Well, in order to achieve that, we are going to have to overclock this thing. And if you aren't familiar with overclocking, what it means is you're basically pushing the hardware inside this thing to run faster than it was ever designed to run. And a byproduct of that is that it produces a ton of extra heat. So we are gonna need to upgrade the cooling on this thing. And we're gonna be doing that in two key ways. So the first of which is just this big, relatively speaking, fan that I installed at the front of the case. This is gonna blow air over the Raspberry Pi and keep it cool by dissipating the heat that way. The second way we're gonna cool it is with this guy. This is a heat sink and it attaches directly to the CPU on the Raspberry Pi and wicks heat away from it, which is then cooled by this fan right here. But even that is not enough to satisfy my thirst for maximum performance. So we're actually going to replace the stock fan on this heatsink, which by the way is like a little light up LED one, which I really didn't want in my case, with this high performance one from Noctua. This is quieter and it moves more air than this one. Fan unhooks. And now we're just gonna put the Noctua one in place. Hook a little retention bracket on there, slide it under the heatsink. There we go, upgraded heatsink. Next, we have a little bit of a compatibility issue. You see, the power connectors that come with these fans aren't really compatible with the power supplies that are on the Raspberry Pi. These are DuPont connectors, and this is a DuPont crimper. So what we're gonna do is crimp a single female pin onto the end of each one of our wires. That will allow us to connect them to individual male pins on the Raspberry Pi. Of course, I don't have a wire stripper small enough to do these teeny little wires, so I'm gonna have to do it the old-fashioned way and try to strip these wires just using a little knife. Wish me luck. I wanna just cut through the plastic shielding without cutting through the actual wire, which is a bit of a delicate operation. All right, that was easier than I thought. Sweet. So now we have the pin and the crimp tool being held in there kind of. I'm gonna insert the wire in. Seems good. Now with a little bit of luck, if I just crimp that on there like that, that should be connected. Yeah, seems pretty good. So now we have this little metal connector and we slide it into one of these little plastic sheaths. These are all extremely technical terms I'm extremely well versed in, as I'm sure you can tell. This guy just goes in here like so. Yeah, it's locked in there. So there's one. Now we gotta do 3 more. We'll just do a quick test here to make sure our fans actually worked and I hooked up everything right. And here's the power switch. And yeah, perfect. Both our fans are spinning nice and smooth. Let's move on. So this little micro SD card here holds the Raspberry Pi's operating system as well as all of the games. And it goes in this little slot on the underside of it, which is gonna be kind of hard to reach once we install it there. So we're gonna sort out the software before we permanently mount this thing in location. So I'm actually gonna kind of breeze through this because this step could be a video onto itself, but the long and the short of it is I'm going to use my main computer here to install RetroPie onto this SD card. Now RetroPie is an operating system for the Raspberry Pi that is specifically geared towards emulation, playing retro games and ROMs and stuff like that. It's just gonna give us a nice, easy to use, clean UI specifically designed for what we want this thing to do. So in summary, pop the SD card into the main computer, write RetroPie to it, pop it out, pop it into the Raspberry Pi, and enjoy. And just like that, we're done. So that's a freshly installed copy of RetroPie. We'll slide that into the Raspberry Pi like so. Now we're ready to install this in the case.
Assembling everything inside the case was pretty straightforward, if a little bit frustrating, but only because I was working with such small pieces inside an already tight case. Instead of using screws to mount the Raspberry Pi, I actually installed a second set of brass standoffs. This set of standoffs would in turn give me somewhere to mount the heatsink, but not before I installed a little bit of thermal paste on the CPU and a little bit of thermal compound on the RAM chip. These pastes help to facilitate heat transfer from the components to the heatsink, and they actually help quite a bit. Without them, the heatsink would be almost useless. So that's something you might want to keep in mind if you're planning on building a similar setup.
Success! Everything fits inside the case. So the way this is set up to work is that that fan at the front is gonna pull cold air in, it's gonna pass over the CPU and the heatsink, and then it's gonna get ejected out this top side. Now, let me show you one little compromise that I had to make on this build that I'm not overly thrilled about. So unfortunately, the Raspberry Pi actually has 2 sets of inputs and outputs. You have these ones around back, which are the USB ports and Ethernet, but then you also have this row of ports here. So this is the power supply, and then this one is the HDMI port. So in order to get those to work, I had to attach 2 right angle adapters to them. Now, obviously I could have just drilled another set of holes there for those cables, but I really wanted all the cables on this thing to come out the backside. So what I'm really gonna do is bring these around and over, and then I'm gonna route them through the top of the box. So this one will go there, that one goes there, and then they just come out the backside. Honestly, not the cleanest and most elegant solution, but it works for now. I think what I would do if I were gonna do this project again is have a cutout here and a cutout here, and then just run extension cables to those cutouts and then glue them in place. But you know what they say, first you make it work, then you make it look good. So let's get this thing booted up and see how it runs. Look at that, that is running quite nicely now. So give me a little bit of time to get this all set up, connected to the Wi-Fi, transfer over some games, and then we will take this thing for a spin. Okay, so that ended up taking a lot longer than I thought it would. I turned off the camera yesterday thinking it'd just be a couple hours, and it ended up taking the rest of the day. But regardless, I now have it set up in the living room, and it's ready to be demoed. As you can see, this is the initial splash screen once you boot up the console, and from here you can pick whatever system you want. We've got the NES, the NDS, the N64, the Sega Genesis, Game Boy, Game Boy Color, Game Gear, Dreamcast, basically every console right up to and including the PlayStation 1 and the PSP. And the best part is all of the games run great, and importantly, they feel just like they used to back in the day. Now, at this point, I should probably point out that running emulators and ROMs is a little bit of a legal and moral gray area. So for my system, I've stuck to only games and consoles that I actually own in real life. They just happen to be collecting dust in my dad's basement right now. Thanks, Dad. The controller I've got here is actually pretty cool too. It's from a company called 8-Bit Do or 8-Bit Do, and it's basically like somebody mashed together a Super Nintendo controller and a PlayStation 2 controller. But it's completely wireless, and it even has rumble functionality built into it. I just need to get like 3 or more of these so that my friends can play too. Another neat feature that this setup has is the ability to remotely manage it. Say I want to download a new game. I can just download it on my main computer and then drag and drop it onto the Raspberry Pi, and it transfers over Wi-Fi. It's really seamless and really easy. Now, unfortunately, I did fall short of my own expectations in this build in a couple of key ways. One, I just don't love this design that much. It's not bad, mind you, but I just also don't feel like it's my greatest work ever. And two, I never really got it to run Wii and GameCube games that well. The fact of the matter is the GPU and the CPU in this thing, even when overclocked, just aren't powerful enough for those platforms. However, I am quite pleased with the way it runs Dreamcast and PlayStation games. And if there's one thing that I learned from Marvel movies, it's that you always leave room for a sequel. If you guys enjoy this video and it does well, then maybe we can do a follow-up to this where we build a second version of this with a lot more computational horsepower and maybe a better chassis design too. We'll see if we can build something that runs Xbox, PS2, PS3, and who knows, maybe even more. So let me know down in the comments if that's something you'd be interested in seeing. And on that note, I think that's a good spot to end this video. As always, I'll include a bunch of links in the video description to all the products I use, as well as a bunch of in-depth guides as to how you can set up your own Raspberry Pi as a retro gaming console. Big thank you to all my Patreon supporters for sponsoring this video and every video I do, and a big thank you to Skillshare for sponsoring this video in particular. As always, I would really appreciate it if you like this video, if you could hit that like button, give it a comment, and subscribe if you aren't already. Now, if you excuse me, I have a little bit of retro gaming to do. I will see you guys in the next video. Peace. Oh, and I almost forgot, I owe you guys a B-roll sequence. Hit it, Bryson.